The fluorescent lights of the diner's bathroom flickered as Sarah Martinez pressed her trembling hands against the cold porcelain sink, willing herself not to cry. The manager's words still echoed in her ears, sharp and cutting like shattered glass. She had endured difficult moments before, raising 2 kids while her husband deployed overseas, working double shifts to keep their small apartment, smiling through exhaustion when customers complained about cold coffee or slow service. But nothing had prepared her for the humiliation of being berated in a public bathroom, trapped between stalls and sinks while her boss's voice grew louder, more vicious, reducing her to something less than human. What her manager didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, as he stood there, red-faced and spitting anger, was that just beyond that bathroom door, sitting quietly in booth 7 with a newspaper and untouched coffee, was a man who had survived things most people only see in movies. A man trained to assess threats, to protect the innocent, to stand firm when others would run. A man who would hear every single word through those thin walls and make a choice that would change everything. Sarah Martinez had been working at Danny's diner for 8 months. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and right now, honest work was all she needed. Her husband, Marcus, had just returned from his 3rd deployment with the Navy SEALs, and they were trying to rebuild some semblance of normal life, the kind of normal where they could have dinner together, without him startling at sudden noises, the kind of normal where she didn't wake up at 3 in the morning, reaching for a phone that wasn't ringing with bad news. The morning shift at Danny's usually passed without incident. There were regulars who knew her name, tourists passing through on their way to somewhere more exciting, and the occasional difficult customer who seemed to think their $10 breakfast entitled them to treat service. Workers like personal servants. Sarah handled them all with practiced grace, a skill she'd perfected during Marcus's deployments when grace was the only thing standing between her and complete breakdown. But Richard Thornton, the day manager, was different. He was a man who measured his worth by his ability to make others feel small. In his late 40s, he wore his authority like ill-fitting armor, constantly adjusting it, testing its weight against anyone he perceived as weaker. Sarah had watched him reduce new hires to tears within their first week. She'd seen him berate the dishwasher for taking a bathroom break. She'd witnessed him snap at elderly customers who took too long to order. She had been careful around him, moving through her shifts like someone navigating a minefield. But this morning she'd made a mistake. Table 12 had ordered eggs over easy. Sarah had written it down correctly, had called it to the kitchen correctly. But somewhere between the grill and the table, those eggs had become scrambled. The customer, a businessman, in an expensive suit, had complained loudly enough for Richard to hear, and Richard had followed her into the bathroom during her break. "You're worthless," he said, positioning himself between her and the door. His voice was low at first, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. "Do you know how easy you are to replace? There are 100 girls just like you, desperate for minimum wage and too stupid to do anything else." Sarah tried to explain about the mix-up, about the kitchen's mistake. But Richard wasn't interested in explanations. He was interested in an audience, and he'd found one, a captive one who couldn't walk away, without losing the job that paid, for her daughter's asthma medication and her son's school supplies. "You're taking up space," Richard continued, his face reddening as he warmed to his subject. "You move like you're half asleep. You smile like an idiot at customers who couldn't care less about you. You're nothing. You understand me? Nothing." The words landed like physical blows. Sarah felt her throat tighten, felt the hot sting of tears she refused to let fall. She thought about Marcus, about what he would say if he could see this moment. He had fought in places where courage meant the difference between life and death, and here she was, unable to even defend herself against a small man's cruelty. What Sarah didn't know was that Marcus had decided to surprise her. He'd woken up that morning in their small apartment, had noticed the way sunlight fell across their bedroom floor, and had thought about how long it had been since they'd shared a meal that wasn't interrupted by nightmares or therapy appointments or the complicated logistics of reintegrating into civilian life. So he'd driven to Danny's diner, slipped into booth 7, and ordered coffee he didn't particularly want, just for the chance to see his wife, smile at customers who didn't know how lucky they were to receive it. He'd been reading the sports section when he heard the raised voice from the bathroom. Years of training had taught him to identify threats by sound, alone, the timbre of aggression, the rhythm of violence, the particular frequency of someone using power to hurt someone weaker. He set down his newspaper and listened. Through the thin bathroom wall, he heard every word, every insult, every attempt at humiliation. He heard his wife's quiet voice trying to respond, trying to maintain dignity in the face of something designed to strip it away. And he felt something cold and clear settle over him, the same focus that had carried him through missions in the dark, through moments when hesitation meant failure. Marcus stood slowly from the booth. He was a tall man, built like someone who'd spent years carrying heavy equipment across hostile terrain. His movements were economical, controlled, nothing wasted. The other waitress, Jenny, whose tables Sarah often helped when the rush got too heavy, saw him walk toward the bathroom and felt her stomach drop. She'd worked at Danny's long enough to recognize trouble, and something about the quiet intensity of the man in booth 7 told her that trouble had just changed sides. Marcus didn't knock. He simply opened the bathroom door and stood in the doorway, filling the frame. Richard spun around, his face still flushed from his tirade, his mouth already opening to bark at this intrusion. But whatever words he'd planned died somewhere between his brain and his lips. "You need to step away from my wife," Marcus said quietly. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah's eyes went wide. Richard's calculation was visible on his face. This was a customer, which meant certain rules applied, but this was also his diner, his territory, his domain to control. "This is a private conversation," Richard finally managed, trying to reassert authority that was already slipping away. "You need to leave before I call the cops." Marcus didn't move. He simply looked at Richard the way you might look at a small, yapping dog, acknowledging its existence without considering it a threat. "I'm going to say this once," he continued in that same quiet voice. "You're going to apologize to my wife. Then you're going to walk into your office, collect whatever personal items you keep there, and you're going to resign. Effective immediately." Richard laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. "You can't tell me what to do in my own restaurant. Do you know who I am? I'll have you thrown out. I'll have you both." "I heard every word you said to her," Marcus interrupted. "Every single word. So did everyone in the diner, by the way. These walls aren't as thick as you think." He paused, letting that sink in. "Now, I've spent years learning how to deal with actual threats. People who were actively trying to kill me and my team. People who had training and weapons and conviction. You're just a small man who found someone he thought couldn't fight back." The transformation in Richard was almost comical. His bluster collapsed like a tent with its poles removed. He looked at Sarah, perhaps hoping to find an ally, someone who would de-escalate this situation. But Sarah was looking at her husband with an expression that mixed relief, love, and something that might have been pride. "I don't have to take this," Richard sputtered. But he was already moving toward the door, already calculating whether his authority over minimum wage, waitresses, was worth whatever this quiet, dangerous man might do next. "You're right," Marcus agreed. "You don't have to take this. You can walk out that door, tell your boss exactly what happened, and face the consequences like an adult. Or I can walk out there and share with every customer in this diner exactly what I heard. Your choice. Either way, you're done here." Richard chose the door. He pushed past Marcus with what little dignity he could muster, which wasn't much. Through the bathroom doorway, Sarah could see curious faces turn toward the commotion. Jenny stood behind the counter, her phone already out, though whether she was calling the owner or simply documenting the moment, Sarah couldn't tell. When Richard disappeared into the back office, Marcus turned to his wife. His expression softened immediately, all that controlled intensity melting into concern. "Hey," he said gently. "You okay?" Sarah nodded, then shook her head, then found herself laughing through tears she'd been holding, back for 8 months of difficult shifts and careful navigation and swallowed pride. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "Wanted to have breakfast with my wife," Marcus said simply. "Seemed like a good morning for it." They stood in that dingy bathroom with its flickering lights and industrial soap smell, and Sarah felt something shift. Not just in that moment, but in all the moments that had led to it. She'd spent so long being strong alone, managing crises by herself, that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside her, not because she couldn't handle it herself, but because she didn't have to. The owner of Danny's Diner, an older Greek man named George who usually worked evenings, arrived within an hour. He listened to Jenny's account, to Marcus's calm recitation of what he'd heard, to the recording Jenny had made on her phone when she'd heard raised voices. He listened to Sarah's quiet explanation of months of similar incidents she'd witnessed but never reported because she needed the job too badly to make waves. Richard Thornton was fired before lunch. George offered Sarah a raise and promoted her to shift supervisor. He also instituted new management training, protocols, and a zero-tolerance policy for harassment. But more than that, he stood in the middle of his diner and apologized to Sarah, to his other staff, to the customers who'd witnessed the confrontation, for allowing such behavior to go unchecked for so long. That evening, Sarah and Marcus sat in their small apartment with their 2 kids. Their daughter, Lily, was working on homework at the kitchen table. Their son, James, was building something complicated with Legos on the living room floor. It was ordinary, domestic, exactly the kind of scene Marcus had pictured during long nights, overseas when ordinary seemed like the most extraordinary thing imaginable. "You didn't have to do that," Sarah said quietly, though her hand found his under the table and held tight. "Yes, I did," Marcus replied. "I've spent years standing up to bad guys with guns. Wasn't about to let some small-time bully hurt my wife in a bathroom. But it was more than that, and they both knew it. It was about dignity, about the value of human beings regardless of their job title or position, about the difference between power and strength. Power was what Richard had wielded, the ability to control someone's livelihood, to trap them in a moment of humiliation. Strength was what Sarah had shown every day, maintaining grace under pressure, protecting her family through deployments and double shifts and 1,000 small indignities. Strength was also knowing when to stand up, even for a stranger, even when it would be easier to look away. The story spread as stories do. Someone had recorded the confrontation, and while Marcus had initially been uncomfortable with the attention, he watched the comment section fill up with stories from other service workers, other people who'd been humiliated by bosses or customers or anyone who'd mistaken their position for permission. He read about the waitress in Michigan whose manager had made her work through a miscarriage, the retail worker in Texas whose boss had mocked his stutter, the janitor in New York who'd been blamed for problems she'd specifically warned management about. And he read the other comments too, from people who said they'd started speaking up when they witnessed mistreatment, who'd reported harassment they'd previously ignored, who'd decided that silence in the face of cruelty was itself a kind of cruelty. 3 months later, Sarah was managing the morning shift at Danny's. She'd implemented new training procedures, had created a system where staff could report problems anonymously, had built the kind of work environment where people didn't have to choose between dignity and paying rent. She still worked hard. She still dealt with difficult customers, but she did it knowing that someone had her back, not just Marcus, though his presence that day had changed something fundamental in how she moved through the world. But also Jenny and George and the regular customers who'd witnessed that bathroom confrontation and decided that Danny's Diner was the kind of place worth supporting, precisely because of how it had handled that moment. Marcus returned to his team eventually. The military doesn't pause for domestic incidents, no matter how justified, but he carried something new with him, a reminder that the principles he'd fought for overseas, the protection of dignity and freedom and basic human worth, weren't abstract concepts reserved for foreign battlefields. They were present in every interaction, every moment when someone had to choose between speaking up or looking away. The lesson wasn't that you needed to be a Navy SEAL to stand up to bullies. Sarah had been standing up to life's challenges long before. Marcus walked through that bathroom door. She'd survived deployments alone, raised kids alone, managed emergencies, and heartbreak and uncertainty, with nothing but her own determination and grace. What that moment in the bathroom represented wasn't rescue. Sarah didn't need rescuing. It was partnership. It was someone saying, "I see you, I value you, and I won't let anyone diminish that value." Years later, when their kids asked about it, because of course the story became family legend, Sarah would tell them that the Real lesson wasn't about the confrontation itself. It was about treating people with dignity, about recognizing that every person you encounter is fighting battles you know nothing about understanding that true strength isn't measured by your ability to make others feel small, but by your willingness to help others stand tall. And on quiet mornings, when Sarah poured coffee for early customers and watched sunrise lights slant through the diner windows, she thought about that bathroom, about flickering fluorescent lights and the moment everything changed, not because someone saved her, but because someone stood beside her and said, "You matter. What happens to you matters, and anyone who thinks otherwise will have to go through me first." That, in the end, was the real power of that moment, not the confrontation itself, but the reminder that we all have the capacity to stand up, to speak out, to refuse to let cruelty go unchallenged. Whether we're Navy SEALs or waitresses, managers or customers, we all make choices every day about what kind of world we want to live in. The kind where power protects cruelty, or the kind where strength protects dignity. The choice always is ours.